Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about the running back strength of schedule for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the channel, you'll know how much I prioritize matchups in fantasy football on a weekly basis. One of the two main variables in terms of why your prospects aren't having incredible performances on a consecutive basis often has to do with the fact that there are 11 other men on the other side of that field with the singular goal of stopping your prospect from gaining yardage and scoring touchdowns. So the more context, the more information we gather regarding those defenses, the more information we'll have in order to help predict the potential successes or failures of those prospects, but in this specific case, the running back position going into the 2022 year. Now, when we go even deeper and talk about the efforts of offensive linemen and how their run blocking grades have done over the last couple of years in comparison to defensive linemen, and getting that into an entire spectrum, and talk about more information that we can gather in order to predict which running backs have the most advantageous schedules going into 2022, regardless of what team they play for. Again, an advantageous matchup can always unlock a potential for a player. And that's why I want to focus on it, not only this offseason, but like I typically do every single episode throughout the regular year. Now, before we get into all this information, because there is a lot of it, and I got to get through it quickly because otherwise we'll be here all day, I want to tell you guys to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're here to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. That is the singular goal of this channel. And in order for me to accomplish that, you got to subscribe down below. For those of you who have not yet already, again, subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. Again, we are on our way to our goal of 60,000 subscribers. We want to get there, crush that goal, and get to 70, 80 this season. So be sure to subscribe down below. Help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship and have an advantage over your league mates every single day. Also, if you're trying to gain more advantages on your league mates, another way to do so is by drafting. It's as easy as that. The more you draft this offseason, the more comfortable you'll be in those difficult decision-making processes throughout a draft that every single one of us have to make. The more experience you have, the better position you'll set yourself in. So in order to gain more experience and to draft more, I implore you to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, for those of you who haven't checked them out, there's a link down in the description. If you go ahead and travel to Underdog Fantasy today and sign up using promo code Andrew, again, not only will you get a $100 first deposit match, but when you make that first deposit using promo code Andrew, it also includes my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings. I will personally be sending you my half and full PPR rankings, which consist of by-tier rankings at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex. So again, if you use promo code Andrew making a first-time deposit, you'll get the deposit match via Underdog Fantasy, and you'll get my rankings. But you won't just get my rankings the first time. You'll also get subsequent updated rankings every Saturday up until September 3rd. So regardless of when you're drafting in the next couple weeks, you'll have my updated rankings in order to help you win a fantasy football championship. So if you're interested, check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the running back strength of schedule for the 2022 season. I wanted to go ahead and start off by presenting some stats and giving you some context as to how I came to this conclusion of my running back strength of schedule list. The statistics to the right of me demonstrate how much total stats in terms of receiving work running backs had for each individual team. For example, the Los Angeles Chargers were at the very top in terms of total fantasy points earned from their respective running backs in 2021 in a half PPR scoring format. So Austin Eckler, Justin Jackson, Joshua Kelly, that entire backfield accumulated those total statistics of 128 targets, 98 receptions, 862 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns, and 183.2 fantasy points. So when we take this into account, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the San Francisco 49ers, who weren't as active in terms of getting their running backs the ball out of the backfield in terms of receiving threats. Now, with this in context, let's move on. The statistics I've transitioned to currently demonstrate how many points in 2021 defenses were giving up to opposing running backs throughout the entirety of the 2021 year. Now, for example, the Seattle Seahawks, they gave up the most receiving fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, how do you gain receiving fantasy points? Receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. Of course, they gave up 189 total fantasy points to opposing running backs throughout the entirety of the 2021 year, while the Jacksonville Jaguars are on the other end of that spectrum, gave up the fewest fantasy points to running backs in terms of receiving stats. Now, the reason why I went ahead and presented these two blocks of stats was because I wanted to go ahead and test the hypothesis this offseason, similar to the way that I did last year. I wanted to test the hypothesis as to whether or not receiving work from running backs actually matters when determining strength of schedule. So in order to give you more context regarding that hypothesis, I went ahead and I tested it out. So let's talk about how I tested it with the Los Angeles Chargers. Last season, they had a total of 17 games in 18 weeks, playing against Washington all the way to Las Vegas from weeks 1 through 18. Now, the primary statistics I wanted to focus on was how many points per game these defenses were allowing last season on a weekly basis in comparison to how many points running backs on the Chargers accumulated in those given weeks against those defenses. Now, obviously, some of these defenses were ranked differently. Some of them gave up a lot of points on a weekly basis, while others were quite difficult to face. So in order to determine whether or not the receiving work that running backs accumulate on a weekly basis and how well defenses have played against said running backs in prior years, I wanted to go ahead and break it down. When we look at the entire 17 games that the Los Angeles Chargers played, they had, in my opinion, based on fantasy points allowed, 8 easy matchups, 7 medium matchups, and 2 hard, difficult matchups in which teams rarely gave up fantasy points to running backs when they were played against last season. Now, what we ended up finding was that the fantasy point per game contributions of Los Angeles Chargers running backs against those 3 different matchups, went as such. Even though the difficult matchups were supposed to be difficult, Austin Eckler, Justin Jackson, these running backs produced 14 fantasy points per week against the 2 difficult matchups that they had last season. While against the 8 easy matchups, they actually didn't perform as well. Now, what we'll continue to see as I test another team is the fact that regardless of whether or not you're facing a difficult or easy matchup at the running back position, receiving work is not predictable. But what we'll eventually find is that if a team wants to prioritize their running backs in the receiving game, regardless of what matchup they play against, whether it's a difficult one or an easy one, they're going to continue to utilize their running backs in the receiving game because that is how their offensive scheme works. And they'll continue to execute that regardless of how defenses play. So, like we saw with the Los Angeles Chargers, even in difficult or medium matchups, they had a far easier time than in the easy matchups in comparison. Now, when we take another team and put it into context, let's talk about the Denver Broncos. Overall, the Denver Broncos were in the middle of the pack, like we saw earlier, in terms of receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns last season. Now, when we look at their 17-game schedule in 2021, taking into account the difficult, medium, and easy matchups last season, it was relatively even across the board. Yes, there were some outliers in some games in which they performed well against easy matchups, but they also did the same against some difficult matchups. And when I continue to test this hypothesis on different teams, the Baltimore Ravens, the Seattle Seahawks, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, what I continue to see was that regardless of matchup, they were going to find success in comparison to teams that don't utilize their running backs in the receiving game. So now that we've taken this into account, the reason why I've presented this is because when I go ahead and I determine my running back strength of schedule, it has nothing to do with receiving work because I've gone ahead and tested and found that it's just an irrelevant stat. It will not inform us of any more information. So we'll just go ahead and we'll isolate rushing yards and rushing touchdowns as the primary statistic that we want to follow. And I went ahead and did that. In 2021, the amount of fantasy points defenses were giving up to opposing running backs on a weekly basis on average in a half PPR scoring format were as such. That is the column immediately to the right of me, which includes the New York Jets on the very top, followed by the Los Angeles Chargers and the Houston Texans. They gave up the most points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis in terms of rushing stats alone. While on the other end of the spectrum, of course, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tennessee Titans, New Orleans Saints, those are the defenses that we talked about all of last season as defenses we do not want to play against in terms of having a running back who is not going to get receiving upside because oftentimes they will struggle against those front sevens as they are extremely talented and are great at stopping the run. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and isolate those numbers and figure out the rankings of how defenses played against the opposing running backs last year and insert that into the 2022 schedule, you would find the statistics on the very right. But though those statistics give us some sort of context, it really doesn't give us the big picture because there's been a lot of changes that have been made, whether it be rookies coming in, free agency, trades, defensive players moving around, some retiring, and also offensive linemen with the same context. Again, trades, rookies, free agency. With all of that change happening, we can't just input these statistics into the 2022 schedule and expect to find our running back strength of schedule. So I didn't. I went one step further. I went ahead and I figured out the run blocking grades of every single offensive lineman that is going to be starting for their respective team in 2022. And what I found was that based on their grades last season, the Philadelphia Eagles, Cleveland Browns, Los Angeles Chargers, Dallas Cowboys, etc., have the best run blocking offensive lines in the National Football League. Again, the Detroit Lions at number 5, Indianapolis Colts at 6, Washington at 7, etc., etc. Until we get to the bottom where we're talking about the worst lines in the league. Houston, the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Chicago Bears. Again, I talk about it every time I mention David Montgomery. He has literally one of the worst offensive lines in the league. And now that we have some context as to the efforts of those offensive linemen, I wanted to also go ahead and compare that against the defensive lines they're going to face. So I took the overall average grades of the entire 5-man offensive line of every single starting team, and I inserted those stats into the 2022 fantasy football schedule, weeks 1 through 17. And I put them up against the defensive linemen that they would be facing on every single week. And I found that the Los Angeles Chargers, Philadelphia Eagles, Dallas Cowboys, the top tier offensive lines have a significant weekly advantage in comparison to others, because though there are great defensive lines in the league, the average advantage that these offensive lines see on a weekly basis throughout a 17-game season is significant. Regardless of who they're facing, they're still an extremely talented bunch. Whether or not you're facing against the Tampa Bay or New Orleans, defensive line, that's going to make a huge difference. And that has already been taken into account. Now, with all of this information, all this context, let's go another step further. Let's talk about defenses in 2022 and how they fare in terms of their overall defensive run-stopping force. Again, this includes corners, safeties, linebackers, defensive linemen, everybody. When you go ahead and you take the average grades of a defense and how they performed last season in terms of overall run-stopping ability, this also includes rookies, which have taken prior year averages of rookie grades based on what round they were drafted in to determine what the average we would anticipate in 2022, and gone ahead and found that the Chicago Bears, Atlanta Falcons, New York Giants, they are predicted by grades that they produced last season to be the worst run-stopping defenses in the National Football League going into 2022, while the New Orleans Saints, Rams, Commanders, 49ers, Colts, they're going to be amongst the best in terms of stopping the run on a weekly basis. Now, this isn't much of a surprise. We've seen this year in and year out be a consistency, but this gives us a little bit more context. So if we go ahead and isolate these statistics and insert them into the 2022 fantasy football schedule, weeks 1 through 17, you would find the statistics on the very right of the screen, which would show the Washington Commanders, followed by the Miami Dolphins, and the New England Patriots having the easiest strength of schedule based on these statistics. But this doesn't take into account everything. This doesn't take into account past performances, offensive line changes, etc. So I've gone ahead, put everything into the blender, and I found the 2022 strength of schedule at the running back position. A lot of work was put into this. If you appreciate the work I've put in, be sure to click the like button down below, because we're going to go ahead and show you the running back strength of schedule for the 2022 fantasy football season as such. The Miami Dolphins, followed by the Washington Commanders, New England Patriots. Again, these are teams that are at the top, whether it was last season's statistics or this season's grades. When you put everything into account, along with offensive line production versus the defensive lines that they face every single week, weeks 1 through 17, we found that those teams had the easiest strength of schedule, while on the other end of the spectrum, Tampa Bay, the Falcons, the New York Giants, San Francisco 49ers, Arizona Cardinals, they had the toughest strength of schedule in 2022 based on all the metrics we've gone ahead and put together today. Now, for those of you who are immediately looking at this list and panicking, thinking, oh my God, my starting running backs are Leonard Fournette, Saquon Barkley, Elijah Mitchell, and James Conner. Andrew, it's time to hit the panic button. My season's over. First and foremost, you need to go ahead and take a deep breath, because like I've mentioned before, the running back position in the strength of schedule that I've calculated does not include receiving work. So when we talk about Leonard Fournette, Tom Brady, and how many times he littered him with targets last season, when we talk about Saquon Barkley, how active he is in the receiving game, James Conner will get more of an expanded role without Chase Edmonds in the lineup. The Pittsburgh Steelers at 25. I mean, again, Najee Harris led all running backs in receptions last season. There are more arguments to be made. While those receiving numbers are isolated, this is really just taking into account the run-stopping grades, the offensive line efforts, the overall fantasy points per game allowed in 2021, because those base defenses are often the same, and the overall potential blender of that without receiving work that gives us these numbers. So as you can see, this is what we have from weeks 1 through 17. And I do want to mention again, if you play in week 18, you need to tell your commissioner to immediately change that. Week 18, we will often see teams bench their starters because they've either made the playoffs or they don't want to risk injury when their season is pretty much done and they have nothing to play for. So be sure to tell your commissioner, and if you are a commissioner of your own league, be sure to change that to a 17-game season, the playoffs beginning in week 15. But let's go ahead and let's talk about isolated overall spectrums of time in 2022, weeks 1 through 7, 8 through 14, and 15 through 17. Let's go ahead and transition to the first 7 weeks of the 2022 season. As you can see on screen, the Cleveland Browns have the easiest strength of schedule. I mean, look at the matchups they have. Carolina, they play against the Jets, Atlanta Falcons, Los Angeles Chargers, New England Patriots. I know that in seasons past, not specifically 2021, but in 2020, 2019, Pittsburgh Steelers defense used to be a force in which we were all afraid of. But again, you got to take into account that last year they were amongst the worst in the league in terms of giving up a bunch of points to opposing running backs. They were getting killed all of last season, mainly because Stephon Tuitt's injury, Tyson Alualu. They're going to get Alualu back. I know Stephon Tuitt retired. They've gone ahead and brought in a couple pieces in terms of their defense, whether it's linebacker, in order to come and make some plays in terms of stopping the run. But ultimately, those first 7 games are extremely advantageous for Nick Chubb. They're going to be running through a lot of defenses, especially considering Jacoby Brissett is going to be the starting quarterback for that team. Now, we'll continue to filter down the Houston Texans. We'll have to wait and see if Dameon Pierce is going to take over. If he does, this could be a very good option for him because if he's able to start off quickly against defenses, I know Indianapolis and Denver are tough, but when you get to Chicago, Los Angeles Chargers, Jacksonville, hit a bye week and play against the Las Vegas Raiders, you may be able to get into a position where you're trading for Dameon Pierce after week 2. After they play against Denver, because he may not put up great performances, or maybe he's not the starter in the first 2 weeks. You end up seeing Marlon Mack struggle, and then there's a switch in week 3, and then you have the rookie running back taking over against some really easy matchups. We move on to Baltimore. Again, J.K. Dobbins is going to have himself an early strength of schedule, that is pretty advantageous. And even though he may not be at a full clip in those opportunities, as long as he's being able to play against some of these easier matchups, we may find a lot of success immediately in 2022, which will only give the team more confidence in keeping him out on the field. Of course, there are a lot of teams to talk about and give more context regarding this. Again, the first bye weeks start in week 6, so that has already been included. But these are the overall averages in terms of strength of schedule. Now, on the very bottom of this list, of course, the Atlanta Falcons, they're going to be in a little bit of trouble. The fact that they play against New Orleans and the LA Rams, 2 of the best run-stopping defenses in the league back-to-back, then a couple weeks later have to play against Tampa Bay, San Francisco. I mean, luckily, Cordero Patterson's a receiving option, and he will be able to benefit because of that. But this early stretch of games for the Atlanta Falcons looks eerily similar to what Cordero Patterson had to face late last season in the final stretch of games in which he was only averaging about 9.88 fantasy points per game in comparison to the 16 fantasy points per game he was averaging throughout the first 9 weeks of the season of 2021. So we may expect a little bit lesser performances from him, but hopefully the receiving work is able to level him out. Either way, this information is here. You can pause, kind of sift through it, get more context regarding it. Let's move on to the next 7 weeks of the season. We have weeks 8 through 14. Now, as we progress, the Miami Dolphins jump to the top, along with the Buffalo Bills, Washington Commanders, Detroit Lions. Now, for those of you who remember on the previous screen, the Detroit Lions were pretty low on that list. I didn't mention them because, again, it's going to be a pure test as to whether or not that offensive line and DeAndre Swift are going to be able to run the ball against some of those tougher run-stopping defenses. We may be in a situation where he doesn't perform in the first 7 weeks. He's a little bit slower off, and you can go ahead and trade for a prospect like DeAndre Swift. Take advantage of that because going further on in the season, weeks 8 through 17, I can assure you he's got the easiest strength of schedule amongst a lot of the teams in the league, and he's going to find a lot of success with the matchups on hand. But nonetheless, this kind of gives you a little bit more context. Obviously, bye weeks are taken into account here from weeks 8 through 14. The final teams that will have bye weeks is going to be in week 14. They're obviously going to be, limping their way to their week 14 bye, but hopefully, these running backs are able to survive to that point. I know the Chicago Bears have a week 14 bye. David Montgomery is going to have to stay healthy. The Washington Commanders, they've already got a running back by committee. So even if one guy goes down, they'll have the services of another to come in and make some plays, especially considering they have a very easy strength of schedule if they're able to command leads and dominate on the ground against Minnesota, Philadelphia, Houston, Atlanta, the New York Giants. I mean, those last 3 games are 11 through 13. Those are incredible matchups that you want to take advantage of. But these are things to just kind of look forward to. It's not something that you want to make a decision on right now for 10 weeks down the line when you don't know whether or not a player is going to get injured and what the team's going to look like, and all these different variables that are going to have to be accounted for, which throughout the regular season I will be presenting on a weekly basis in order to give you more context and help you make the right decisions to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Either way, more context, more information, who has a better strength of schedule midway through the season, who you may be wanting to target in terms of a trade option. After the first 7 weeks, you may have to go after some of these players because they do have extremely advantageous matchups in comparison to the first 7 slate. If you're going to see a running back end up producing not so great numbers and then all of a sudden has an incredible strength of schedule upcoming, like where's the Atlanta Falcons at this point? Atlanta Falcons went from being the most difficult strength of schedule to the 9th at this point. Cordero Patterson could very easily turn it around, and he could be a cheaper option that you may be able to trade for, invest in, and find value throughout the longevity of the season. Now, the final thing that I wanted to mention on today's episode, something that a lot of you look forward to, is the fantasy playoff strength of schedule. Again, the entire purpose of these videos is to help you get to the fantasy playoffs and secure a Week 17 championship. I mean, that is the entire goal. And in order to do so, there's a lot of players here that we have to mention in regards to having incredible strength of schedules. We're talking about just top down. Jonathan Taylor, DeAndre Swift, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins, Derrick Henry, Breece Hall, David Montgomery, Alvin Kamara. Those are just the names amongst the top in terms of the easiest strength of schedules. We even get, the New England Patriots, those 2 running backs, Damian Harris or Ramondre Stevenson. There's going to be a lot of potential here when you're playing against, some of these easy matchups. Look at Detroit playing against the New York Jets, Carolina Panthers, Chicago Bears. Oh my gosh. DeAndre Swift, please get there healthy. Please do not be limping to our Week 15 playoffs. Because if you can get there healthy and your offensive line is intact, they're going to be running through these teams and putting up insane fantasy points. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there's obviously some tougher matchups. You look at what Cleveland has to go up against. Baltimore, New Orleans, Washington. Those front sevens are so difficult to face up against on a weekly basis, much less on a consecutive 3-game streak. You have to do that in the fantasy playoffs. While Nick Chubb early on is going to be great, maybe later on in that season, if he's slowing down, if Deshaun Watson's presence doesn't impact and elevate these players, the trade deadline will eventually be in this area, and you may have to make some moves in that regard. But either way, hopefully this gives you more information. Hopefully this gives you more context as to the strength of schedule at the running back position, all of the effort and all of the statistics that I gathered in order to find the pure answer as to who has the easiest strength of schedule in the 2022 season. Again, to give you a final recap, we'll transition to the running back strength of schedule weeks 1 through 17. Again, make sure you're not playing in a Week 18 championship game, please. Especially for those of you who play in those consecutive back-to-back connective weeks where your playoffs are weeks 15, 16, and then 17, 18. You have 2 matchups. Get rid of those. Please get rid of those. The primary reason you want to get rid of those is because you can't move the schedule back down. Because Week 14, there are bye weeks. And, Week 18, there are people that are benching their top players because they're making the playoffs. And, they don't want to injure their studs going into that week. So, again, play 3 primary weeks of the playoffs, 15, 16, and 17. And hopefully, we'll all be there winning championships this year. Anyway, this is the running back strength of schedule for the 2022 season. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Be sure to click the like button down below. Subscribe if you have not yet already. Of course, check out Underdog Fantasy and use promo code Andrew today. Again, not only will you get a deposit match on your first time deposit up to $100, but you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half full PPR scoring format sent to you personally from my email to yours, and in the subsequent weekly Saturday updated rankings up until September 3rd. I want to thank you guys for watching. Tomorrow, we will talk about the wide receiver strength of schedule. Again, like I've mentioned in weeks past, without spoiling it, there are some wide receivers that are going to have really advantageous matchups that majority of the fantasy football landscape has been kind of sleeping on. And of course, these matchups will be able to potentially elevate them into that wide receiver 2, maybe even wide receiver 1 conversation when it's all said and done. But either way, that'll be tomorrow. And until next time, I want to thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.